Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will be starting shortly. There's just a technical delay. We will be starting shortly. Apologies.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining Tshimong Talks. Again, our humble apologies for this delay. We don't want to delay this incredible conversation that you guys have been anticipating for this period of time. It's a very important conversation that we're having today because we're talking about probably the most pressing issue in our society faces globally, which is something that I think is underestimated when we talk about 21st century education and the 21st century education question here on Tshimong Talks. So today we are particularly going to be speaking about that, and I'll introduce our guest just now, but I want to really set up the framework for the discussion itself, right? So I want to quote one of my favorite education specialists, and I think if you're in the education space, this is someone that would probably be your favorite as well. You've probably seen every TED talk by this guy. It's Sir Ken Robinson. And he says, we have to go from what is essentially an industrial model of education, a manufacturing model, which is based on linearity and conformity and batching people. We have to move to a model that is based on more on the principles of agriculture. We have to recognize that human flourishing is not a mechanical process. It's an organic process. And you cannot predict the outcome of human development. All you can do, like a farmer, is create the conditions under which they will begin to flourish. And that's Sir Ken Robinson. And then in this episode, we're discussing 21st century education. We're discussing, what does it take to put together an education system that is fit for the global mandate right now, and that is fit for the status quo in our society, given the rapid changes. I think we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we talk about machine learning, we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about all of these things, but I don't think we have a grasp really on, the implications this has on the living education problems that we have as a society at large. And joining me today is someone really, really, really special that I've kept waiting, and I'm so sorry, man. This is literally my very best friend, Bongani Masilela. He's the co-founder of Tshimong. He's an education specialist. He's a learning designer by profession, and he's also doing his master's in education at the University of Witwatersrand as well. Bongani Masilela, my brother, how are you doing?
Doing well, and you?
I'm great. I'm just glad to be on the talk finally, man.
Long last.
I think it's the first time Bongani sees me kishele brush cut in like a year and a half. So,
exactly.
if
that's how I know winter's over.
If his facial expression is a bit weird right now, it's because I try this cheese scope over here. All right. So, Bongani, just to get straight into it, I think it's very important for us to set the scene. Whenever we start our Tshimong programs, especially when we begin with the Tshimong Academy, we really come in and contextualize the education crisis to our learners, because really our learners, especially here in South Africa, are faced with a triple threat. The first threat they're faced with is this issue of low matriculation outcomes, right? Where 6 out of 10 matriculates finish grade 12, and 1 in 10 qualify for tertiary education. They're faced with a high unemployment rate, where 1 out of 2 people don't work and 1 out of 3 graduates don't work. And we're facing a changing society that's changing beyond any historic precedent. We've never had such rapid changes over human civilization, and we just can't seem to catch up. You know what I mean? So really, that's the situation that we find ourselves in right now. So the first question I have to you, Bongani, from your perspective is, why do we have, because I just want the audience to understand this issue, right, from a specialist perspective. From your understanding, why do we have such low matriculation outcomes? And from your perspective, how can we fix this?
Yeah. So I think there are a number of reasons. The first one is a conversation that everyone wants to have. And the second one is a conversation that no one wants to have, right? So with the first one, the conversation that everyone wants to have, that's the sexier one. That's the one about how we have a skills shortage. Our education system is broken. If only we teach more kids how to code and how to do robotics, maybe we'll fix our schools and maybe we'll prepare them for the future. And I think that's a very sexy conversation to have, because the idea of having, millions of kids who can code and do robotics, these mysterious activities that are as mysterious as the future, is such an exciting conversation to have, that people are willing to throw money at it and throw policy changes at it. And so that's the conversation that everyone is having, right? The so-called fourth industrial revolution. And I say so-called because I used to be an ardent believer in the idea that, the fourth industrial revolution is here. Let's panic. Let's prep our kids for it. Whereas now I'm starting to question a lot of the tenets of the fourth industrial revolution and the panic around that. So the second conversation, the one that no one wants to have, is the fact that education in South Africa has actually gotten better over the last 20 years. Factually, it has.
Nobody wants to have that conversation. That's very interesting. And it's, intuitively, that sounds like a controversial statement, but carry on.
Exactly. It sounds like a controversial
Yeah.
statement because, every year we look at our matric pass rate, we're not happy with that. We look at the exemption rate, we're not happy with that. And I'm not necessarily saying that the South African education system is doing the best that it can. Certainly by global standards, it's falling behind in many areas. But there are very simple facts that you need to concede to before critiquing the education system. The first one is that we have more literate people than we've ever had in South Africa, right? And that in and of itself is incredible, that over the last 20 to 30 years, we've lifted more people out of illiteracy into literacy than we've ever had in our history, right? Most of our grandparents to this day probably still can't read, or at least can't read for meaning, right? They're great at, telling oral stories and all of those things, but they can't necessarily read. And I think sometimes we take for granted the education system we had in the past, which excluded, Black people from good quality education versus what we have now. Most of our kids can read. Most of them can use a smartphone. And again, I don't think people appreciate enough the gravity of kids being able to use TikTok and Facebook and Snapchat, because those things look useless. But the fact of the matter is we have a technologically literate, literate population of young people in South Africa right now. And they are, more educated than our parents and our grandparents were. But the education system is broken and there are many areas that we can fix. But I think the conversation people don't want to have is that improvements have been made.
Yeah, I think that's very important, right? It's important to distinguish where we come from, where we were, to where we are. And it's also very important to appreciate, in comparison to where we were, the trajectory of where our country was going to go. Do you see what I'm saying? I think that's a very, very important statement to make up front. But I really want to, I really want you to really harp on this notion before I get to the second question, on questioning the core tenets of the fourth industrial education, or at least questioning the tenets of fourth industrial education discourse, which seems to be, something very poorly understood by most people that have the microphone right now. So talk to me about disabusing ourselves of some of these important notions from your perspective.
Okay, so the idea for our education, again, once upon a time, literally 8 months ago, I was invested in the conversation. But then I found out some very interesting and scary facts, right? Like the fact that in Switzerland, 70% of university age going young people don't go to university. That's just the first thing, right? They most of them go to vocational education institutions so that they can learn how to work in factories and build, Rolexes or cars or furniture or whatever the case may be. And a country like Switzerland, for all intents and purposes, is a model for developed country and developed education system. Absolutely. And they rank pretty highly in global rankings. Germany, about 60% of young people don't go to a traditional university. They do vocational education, and then they do an apprenticeship at a factory. Most of them don't code. Most of them don't do robotics or anything fancy that we're being told is that is part of the discourse right now. And so when I first found out about that, I took a step back and asked myself, why is that the case? Why is it the case that in South Africa, we have entire 4 IR commissions, but in Switzerland, 70% of young people will probably never learn how to code. Instead, they learn how to work in a factory, which we're being told is outdated and is outmodeled and is something that belongs in the 1920s. And the reason for that is very simple. Most developed countries have education systems that don't try to predict the future, but instead try to nurture young people who are capable, young people who love learning, young people who are capable of learning things, and young people who learn things that are appropriate for their economies. What we're trying to do in South Africa, we're trying to do the reverse, where we produce these skills, assuming that producing skills will grow the economy. Whereas in actual fact, we do actually have a glut of IT graduates in South Africa right now who are unemployed. And so the question is the issue that we don't have enough fifth grade teachers teaching kids how to code in their life orientation classes, in their mathematics classes, or is the issue that we don't have a pipeline between education and good dignified jobs? And I think the latter one is a conversation that a lot of people don't want to have. So 4IR education for me is a bit of a, I don't know, I don't want to say it's an entirely useless conversation, right? Because I still want to make my niece and my godson learn how to code. But at the same time, it's like, are we having this conversation because we're scared of the future? Or are we having it because we're responding to something that's happening in industry right now?
So, Bonani, you say very, very important things, because I feel like what's happening in South African education in particular, just to kind of echo what you've just said right now, because I'm going to ask you to dig deeper into something else you've just said. Yeah. I feel like the problem with South African education, echoing you, right, is the fact that, so you're saying there's an obsession with the future,
yeah,
but an obsession with the globalized future agenda. So not necessarily an obsession with an intra-African and intra-South African agenda. And I'm saying that to say, the conversation about 4IR education is so rampant right now in SA, but it's in tension with the conversation of reindustrializing South Africa and reindustrializing the continent. And what you're saying is that so-called industrialized countries, right, all they've done in their education system is that they've kept their industrialized base, and they've kept their education system to churn out industry, to keep industry, and to keep that base. Talk to me about, kind of how we can do that kind of thing. How can we marry two existing discourses that seem to be in serious tension right now? Because it doesn't seem like we're going to reindustrialize our continent anytime soon with these conversations in mind.
No, that's a very good thing to point out. And I like the fact that you use the word industrialization, right?
Yeah.
Because, in my research, I recently found out that Africa right now has a higher proportion of educated people than Europe had at the same level of industrialization, right? So just to repeat that, Africa has more educated people at our current level of industrialization than Europe and Asia had at a similar level of which means we've overeducated our population, ironically enough, right? Like, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
And again, that would sound like a controversial statement, but carry on. You're helping us unlearn some specific notions that are shoved in our faces.
And I'd like to clarify that I don't think it's a bad thing that more kids than ever before in Africa are going to school. I think it's that, the alternative is a miserable life where if you are illiterate, you're not empowered, you're not able to take part in the workplace or in the global community that we live in. So certainly not a bad thing. And we should push for 100% of kids in Africa to get an education. But I find it interesting that we've churned out more educated people than we have built industries that can absorb all of those educated people. And so right now, the conversation in Africa around producing, millions of educated people, we talk about a skills shortage. The difference between us and what was done in many European countries like Switzerland and Germany is that we don't have strong social partnerships, or what's known as strong social partnerships. So this isn't an idea that was developed by myself, but many academics have developed this idea. To give you an example, in Germany, you have a very strong relationship between regional governments and business associations and unions, all of whom agree that every year we need to educate a particular number of young people who will go to, let's say, vocational education training institutions, spend 8 months there, and then, or spend 4 months there, and then 8 months doing an apprenticeship at a company. And then the government will fund them and give them a stipend so that they can work at these companies and subsidize these companies' salary costs. They go back to the TVETs for about 4 months and then back to the companies for 8 months. What this social partnership does is that it ensures that there's a virtual cycle of skills attainment, jobs, and so on. In Africa, we don't have a similar social partnership where government, business associations, and workers' associations agree that if we produce 100,000 skilled young people, they will guaranteed have jobs so that they're incentivized to get more skills because they know that there's a job. In our context, we're upskilling and educating young people, but there's no absorption from the side of industry at all. And so this social partnership is non-existent. And, in South Africa, we've tried to build one. The problem, though, to answer your question, is that you can't build one. Right? In Europe, it happened over 80 to 100 years organically, where regional governments, business associations all agreed that if we're going to be competitive, this is what we need to do. So top down is a bit difficult to achieve. You need a very organic social partnership to achieve something like that.
So, speaking of that, I think this segues us very nicely into the next part of our conversation, because again, on the triple threat issue, the big issue that we're facing in South Africa is the issue of high unemployment. We have one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world, right? It's a terrible thing. And, you can't avoid the connection between a high unemployment rate and an education system in as much as you can't avoid a high unemployment rate with industry in and of itself, right? So speak to us about, what are the things that are not working right now in South Africa insofar as causing this high unemployment rate linked to the education system. Maybe you can even make analysis around, comparatively, what do our social partnerships look like in comparison to Germany and Switzerland and the like, and how can we make them work? Because we have all these youth employment stimulus programs, Tshimong is also part of one of these things. You know what I'm saying? Like, they're everywhere. It's the biggest conversation right now. It's the one thing that's going to get the president back into power, right? Is creating all these jobs for young people. But what are we doing wrong? What's missing? Or are we doing something right? Are we on the way to something that's going to make sense?
Yeah. I think the one thing we do wrong in South Africa a lot of the time is many South Africans don't realize that we have amazing policies in this country. That's my favorite thing about South Africa, is the imagination of people in government who draw up some of the most amazing policies in the world, in my opinion. Our education policy is pretty strong. I think South Africa has one of the highest percentage to GDP expenditure on education. And by and large, the education system the education department is one of the least corrupt, relatively one of the least corrupt departments in the country, which means we have great policy, great funding, and well-meaning people working in all of those departments. I think, though, what's going to solve the issue of unemployment is taking greater risks as far as hiring young people. Because in South Africa right now, we also have a growing graduate unemployment rate, right? And a lot of my research centers around ICT graduates. So graduates in the information and communication technology spaces, cloud technology, software development, all of those things. So we have thousands of those people unemployed, but we also have a shortage of 70,000 critical IT skills in South Africa right now. So the question you ask yourself is, how do we have a shortage of 70,000 ICT posts in the country and thousands of unemployed ICT graduates? Well, the caveat in that fact is that the shortage in that 70,000 largely lies in middle level skilled jobs. In other words, 2 or 3 years of experience. And so a lot of the unemployed people in South Africa right now are recent graduates, right? A lot of whom don't have any work experience. And so the reason why companies aren't willing or companies still cry about the shortage is the fact that the type of person they're looking for is one with at least 2 to 3 years of work experience and not necessarily a fresh graduate. Where countries like Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland get it right is that they have a seamless apprenticeship system that takes risks on young people to give them that 2 or 3 year head start so that by the time they're done with school, they meet the requirements of entry level. In South Africa, I don't think a lot of large organizations take that risk on young people to give them that 2-3 year head start. But as a result of not giving them that 2 or 3 year head start, they're also kind of shooting themselves in the foot because now they're stuck with a skills shortage that they could otherwise deal with. So I think where, initiatives like Yes for Youth come in is that they try bridge that by providing young people with 12 months. But I think a lot of research has found that 12 months is not enough. You need at least 2 or 3 years of internship experience in order to be considered middle level skilled, so that you can fill the job posts that are vacant right now. So I would say taking greater risks on young people is step number one. And 2 or 3 years, not 12 months, is a huge part of the solution.
So just to understand the logic of the potential solution here. So if we have a gap of 70,000 vacancies in the IT space, a need for that, right?
Yeah.
Are you saying that if we have internship programs and internship opportunities like Yes and all those kinds of things, if young people are in those concerted programs for 2 to 3 years, we will then begin to fill that deficit on the other side? Would industry be more incentivized to hire these young people on a permanent basis because of that? Is that what we're missing, from that perspective?
So I'd like to stay away from presenting a dead set solution, because I'm also currently still doing research on this. So when I talk about that 2 to 3 years of experience, this is just based off of research that has already been done. And what I'm trying to figure out is whether or not that is in fact part of the solution, or is in fact part of answering the question of why young people are unemployed. But certainly we can confidently say that, just by going on LinkedIn or any job posting platform, entry-level jobs do require a bit of job experience, which a lot of recent graduates simply do not have. So there's another problem that actually stems from that, because on the one hand, you have young people who aren't being given an opportunity to get work experience. But on the other hand, you have young people who are still in primary and secondary level schooling, who look at that situation, their older brothers and sisters and cousins who did everything correctly, going to school, getting a qualification. You have young people in primary and secondary looking at that situation and also not being incentivized to do well in school as a result. And so what you end up having is young people not being hired, and then younger people looking at that situation and wondering, is there any use in working hard in school? Is there any use in going to tertiary and studying, for technology? I'm being told that we're in for IR. I'm being told that there are millions of jobs being created in tech. Yet my older brother, who has a diploma in software development, is unemployed. Yet this guy can build an application for a hospital that can store patient files and manipulate the data and help with diagnosing diseases in the community. This guy built an app like that in his 3rd year, and yet he's unemployed. And so you have people in younger grades who are also disincentivized from doing well in school, because there's just a gap between industry demands and the supply in the form of, their older brother who couldn't get a job.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is, and you know what, I think this is very important information, guys. I think, I always say that the education industry is the only industry where basically everybody in the world is in, right? Because at one point or another, you are either a stakeholder in the education industry, you are some kind of person of interest, you are a beneficiary, you are whatever your involvement is in the education system. It is the only industry in the world where you're definitely guaranteed to be in. So it's very, very, very important to think about these things and really contextualize these issues. And on that, I wanna dive into a conversation. And guys, for the audience perspective, can I just say, if you have any questions or whatever, please feel free to throw your questions in the chat, in the Q&A section, and all those kinds of things. Bongs will probably be able to answer those questions as well. So start throwing them in, and all those kinds of things. But I want to get into a conversation that Bongani and I probably have very often in private, where we really talk about the history of the education system between where we come from and where we are today, right? Because Bongani, my question is linked to, we are in this issue of rapid change because of technology, right? And the education system at some level, at least this is my assumption, has always kind of been able to catch up to what's happening in industry, right?
Yeah.
When the Industrial Revolution came about, maybe the first or the second Industrial Revolution came about, with the steam engine, people and factories and all those kinds of things. Schools started to set themselves up like the conventional classrooms that we have today, where everybody's in a row and we stand in line and there's a bell ringing at a specific time, and all this kind of stuff, preparing people to work in these industries that are existing right now, and all those kinds of things. So talk to me about the challenges that we face right now in terms of the rapid changing education system, and how do we catch up versus where we come from in global education. What did education look like in the past? And from a policy perspective, how was it always conventionally looked at and drafted?
Okay, so I'm going to give a very unsexy response to that and say we've actually never...
No sexy responses allowed.
No. So to be honest, we've never gotten it right, because number one, the thing with industrial revolutions or what we get wrong is that in 2022 or since the 2010s, we try to predict what's going to happen, whereas how the term industrial revolution, how it normally works is that you only label it retrospectively by asking yourself, what happened between the year 1750 and 1867? Well, we developed the steam engine, we did A, B, and C. Oh, snap, that was the first industrial revolution. Okay, but was there a clear distinction between the first and the second? Well, I would say the use of electricity and oil is the clear distinction between number 1 and 2. Okay, was there a distinction between 2 and 3? I would say computers. What we're doing in 4IR is that we're so keen on diagnosing what we're in right now and what's happening in the future, that it's also caused a moral panic around the state of our schools and whether schools are preparing people for the future or not. Whereas if you look at the factory model education system, like you mentioned, sitting in rows, bell ringing, 30 kids in a class, teacher teaching, rote learning, that wasn't something that was created in anticipation for an industrial revolution. It was actually created in response to what already existed, which is why at a similar level of industrialization, European countries didn't have anywhere near the number of educated people we have in Africa right now. Why? Because one, most learning actually took place on the job. That's the first thing, is most learning took place on the job. Now, it's not that teachers taught kids how to build cars. Teachers only created an environment where kids learn how to love learning, where they learned how to read, they learned basic skills, they were nurtured, and then kids' minds, were open enough to pick up more skills at a tertiary level, and pick up more skills at work. Even with the internet, to give you a cool example, most CEOs of major tech companies today, Microsoft, Google, all of these companies, if you look at what qualification most of them have, it's engineering, right?
Yes.
Why is that? Because in the 1980s, no one could anticipate that the internet would A, be developed for mass consumption, and that B, you would need millions of coding skills. In the 1980s, engineering was still a very big, popping qualification. So you had this mass of engineers who, when the internet came along, had to pivot and learn on the job in order to align themselves to the needs of industry. No one cried about the lack of software programmers in the 80s. No one tried to predict the rise of the internet. We worked with what we had. We educated engineers. And when the internet came about in the 90s, all we did was reskill our engineers in the workplace. And so for me, what we're doing right now, one of the biggest mistakes in 4IR, we're putting unnecessary pressure on teachers and schools to do something that they actually never had to do, which is keep up with a future that they don't even know exists and that we don't even know exists. We're berating schools for not introducing coding there, but it's like, for goodness sake, in 5 years, the needs of businesses might change. And guess who you're going to blame after 5 years? Teachers again, right? Schools and teachers. And not to say that they don't have their mistakes. They do have many errors. But the fact of the matter is, in the past, we never put so much pressure on teachers to try predict the future. The only thing we ask them to do is educate young people, nurture them, and make sure that they're capable of learning more in the future, either at tertiary or on the job. So again, unsexy answer, I would say, A, we need to stop putting as much pressure on teachers, right, to predict the future, and let them focus on their job, which is teaching young people, and nurturing their minds. And, as time goes on, then we start having the conversation around, okay, how do we introduce coding into schools? Are our schools functioning? How do we introduce coding? How do we make sure that on-the-job training is functioning? And not a lot of the noise that we're applying onto teachers right now.
100%. And I think you pointed something interesting about most of the biggest tech CEOs right now being engineers.
They never learned how to code in grade 8.
Yeah, no. It wasn't even a thing that they did, right? And no CEO right now knows how to code, for goodness sake. You know what I'm saying? And so talk to me about this notion before I get into the questions, because we got a question from Shane Wolf over here, which is a very fantastic question, and I'll read out just now. Because one can argue that there are programs, interventions, experiences, degree options that can teach you requisite competencies that can put you in a position to thrive in this current industry that we find ourselves in, right? So someone can say one or two things about engineers, for example, because the fact that they're being taught how to be process thinkers, their psychological infrastructure is really that, right? They can manage large corporations with very complex systems, and they themselves can create complex systems. And hence they are attractive to big banks, right? To be CEOs, as opposed to financiers or bankers themselves or lawyers. Do you see what I'm saying? So what are these? Talk to me about this notion of competencies, because some may argue that rather educate by competency, not necessarily by education by skill. Is it a dichotomy that's necessary? Can we just teach both at the same time? How can we, I don't want to say future-proof ourselves, right? Because that's not our conversation. But, how can we make sure that we're ready?
Look, and where I will agree with the sexy conversation is, at least personally, with all the things that I've said right now about labeling the 4IR and absorbing people into industry, I still think there is value in teaching kids how to code, right? I still think that kids in grade 5 and the 6th grade need to learn how to code and use robotics and things like that. I think the conversation, however, as you correctly point out, do we put pressure on schools to prepare a particular type of worker for a particular type of industry and particular type of competency? I don't know. I'd argue that the jury is still out on whether that's effective or not, putting pressure on an 8th grade teacher to develop an AI software programmer, because that's what we're going to do in the future, as opposed to an 8th grade teacher just focusing on teaching a kid how to code, for goodness sake, right? And then having the kid decide later on in their own lives, based on the needs of industry, what they need to focus on. So I would say at a base level, the same way teaching kids how to read is very useful, even though that kid might end up doing a job that has nothing to do with linguistic skills or anything like, you still need them to have those basic skills like reading and mathematics. And I think that coding has now become a primacy literacy issue, I would argue, because of the pace in which computers are developing. So again, I'm not taking away from the fact that we need kids to learn how to code and that we need kids to learn. Of course not. I think there is value in a lawyer knowing how to code. There is value in an accountant learning how to code. The issue, though, the issue, I mean, the other day I had a task at work that honestly, it took 2 days, but I know for a fact with coding, based off of the coders that I've seen, could have done it in an hour as opposed to 2 days. So my job, despite not explicitly saying it needs coding, I do think needs a bit of coding as well. So we still need those skills, but I think we need to focus more on, I wouldn't say perfecting, but getting those skills right before we focus on zoning in on developing a particular type of skill. However,
Right. Mm-hmm.
countries where specialization at a young age works, like the countries I used earlier on, your Switzerland and your Germanys, are countries that have a very clear school to work pipeline. We don't have that in South Africa because, again, we lack the social partnership. So I would say until we develop a social partnership that
there are only 6, so sorry to disturb the bounds, there are only 6 STEM related schools of specializations in the whole of Gauteng. Only 6.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But that's not a problem, right? A lot of people think it is a
Okay.
problem. The reason I say it's not a problem is because STEM schools, right, are only as effective as industry is absorbing. That's it. So if industry is not absorbing, you can build 100 STEM. That's it, right?
Yeah.
And the social partnership. So if industrial firm A every year guaranteed hires 5,000 young people straight out of school, knowing that they're not experienced, but takes a risk on them, then you can have the conversation about 100 STEM schools. But if you're building 100 STEM schools for the sake of an industry is not absorbing them, guess what you're going to have? A graduate unemployment problem. That's what you're going to have. And that's the reason why a country like America, for example, doesn't have a thriving TVET system, whereas Germany does. Why? Because in the US, that social partnership doesn't exist. It's a much more liberal labor market, a much more liberal market economy, as Hoskers and Hall would say. So it's much more liberal in a sense that you work wherever you want to work, companies hire whoever they want to hire. In Germany, the social partnership does exist. Therefore, schools can specialize a lot. It's very entrenched in education, in families at the dinner table, in government. It's so entrenched that if your kid at 18 specializes early, chances are they will get a job at a BMW factory because BMW is part of the social partnership. In SA, do we have that? I don't think we do. You know, if you learn how to code from the age of 15, 16, and you specialize in AI, there's no guarantee that there's the company that will absorb you and the 5,000 other people learning that. If there was, then we could increase the number of STEM schools, I would argue.
So my biggest takeaway, and I'm probably going to use it in our summary when we conclude, but for me, the biggest takeaway that I'm hearing, Bongani, from your research and from the perspective that you're offering us today is this issue of social compacts, you know, and how do we activate them? How do we synthesize them? Because we can hack these things sometimes, you know. They don't have to be built over 100 years, I believe. Some of these things can be hacked by a policy and all sorts of measures. But we'll talk about that just now. We've got 2 brilliant questions, you know, before we get to the concluding part, right? So we got a question from Shane Wolf over here and another question from Tulani. Let's start with Shane, right? So greetings. I'm currently an undergraduate student studying towards a bachelor in education. Shout out to you, Shane. Now, my question largely lies on the basis of curriculum. Can we say that the curriculum is doing enough to prepare students for those tertiary stimulus or problems that lie largely at the education, at the higher education sector? So from my understanding of the question is, Bongani, is our basic education system even preparing people to cope in varsity? In a world where we want to hyper prioritize varsity, are we even achieving that? And the second question is from Shane is, what is your view on the majority of the teachers poll is only degree holders and that they're not interested in furthering their studies? And what do you think, you know, do you think teachers should actually further their studies beyond what they have right now? Or whatever, right? So those 2 questions. Are we prepping people for tertiary, assuming that that's the mandate right now? Are we actually doing it? And secondly, is it enough for a teacher to have 1 degree?
So on the first question, and here I'm going to quote ideas from my brilliant supervisor, Professor Stephanie Alays, who has written numerous research papers and has gone on media platforms to basically, trying to wrest this notion that we need curriculum reform, because South Africa has reformed its curriculum so many times in the last 30 years. And every single time we reform it because we're afraid that we're not keeping up with the demands of industry, or we're not preparing young people for university. And again, we're one of the few countries in the world that cry so much about curriculum reform. Going back to the example of developed countries, right, particularly those in Europe, if 70% of kids are going to university, aren't going to university, it means that their curriculum is probably still the same as it looked like 30 years ago. Why? Because they're not obsessed with, are we doing enough? What they're obsessed with is, are we running our schools properly? And are we teaching our kids to learn to love learning, period? So that when they make the decision about what they're going to do in future, then they're prepared. The curriculum doesn't deal with the fact that when young kids go home at night, their parents don't help them with homework, right? The curriculum doesn't deal with the fact that kids aren't stimulated by science. The kids don't like science. You can reform the curriculum as much as you can, but there's no organic, love of learning, organic love of science and technology that can prepare those kids for university. I mean, South Africa right now has numerous languages in our education system. Most kids have to learn 2 languages. I don't remember much of Afrikaans, even though I did it in high school. And the reason for that is because I haven't applied it much in my context, right? And so, but someone might turn around and say, let's reform the curriculum to make sure people like Bongani retain Afrikaans better. But what do you mean by let's reform the curriculum for that? Because if we're not using those skills, then it doesn't matter how many times you reform the curriculum, the skills won't be retained because they're not being used. And so to answer the question about preparing young people for university, the university pipeline in South Africa is also very thin because we have a limited number of universities. So as a result, young people aren't really incentivized to also develop the characteristics in them that will prepare them for university. Why? Because most people in their family haven't gone to university. That's a problem, right? So where they're meant to see people modeling these behaviors, the curriculum will not achieve what people are supposed to develop in themselves or what their families are supposed to model. It won't. You can, introduce Mandarin and coding and, Saturday classes. And then what?
So there's no inherent love for learning. And that's what you say an education system should be able to achieve. I like that very much.
Not just an education system, a society.
As
a society. We're putting too much pressure on education. 8 hours a day, you're not going to achieve that.
100%. Let me skip over to the next question from Tulani. Thank you very much for that question, Shane. Sorry we couldn't really answer your second question, but we pressed for time. So from Tulani says, at Bongani, what do you think is the reason why businesses are unwilling to take risks on inexperienced labor? Is it a reflection on business or education? Why is that?
It is. This is not my research. I'm trying to remember who. I think it was Hall and Soskis, these really brilliant. They're more economic researchers than education, but they basically categorize 2 types of economies that exist in the developed world. So South Africa, we can argue where we fit in. One is called a liberal market economy, which is like dogged competition, United States of America, profit-driven, perfect information to the market. The other one is a coordinated market economy, which is what you get in Germany, where companies don't aim to monopolize and beat each other and compete for workers. They aim to coordinate themselves so that the German economy can do well. And they forego profits and they forego competitive advantage in order to make sure that the German economy does well. So that's more of a coordinated market economy. South Africa falls, I would argue personally, right, more on the liberal side, where everyone is competing in a dog-eat-dog world for profits, technology, and workers. And so what you have in a liberal market economy is companies fear hiring 500 young people, developing them only to lose them to their competition. Which is why in countries like the US, UK, and South Africa, companies are so afraid of investing in skilling their workers because they might leave and go to their competitors. In a coordinated market economy like Germany and Denmark, there's so much coordination that your competitor probably even pays their workers exactly the same as you, which means they can't poach your workers because of the level of coordination that exists there. It's not quite communism and socialism. It's just, it's still capitalist, but it's more of a coordinated capitalism where companies are incentivized to upskill workers, because even if they leave and go to their competitors' workers could equally leave and come to their companies. And that's why in South Africa, companies won't invest in developing.
So who coordinates? Who coordinates in that system? Who's in charge of that?
It's a 100-year-old relationship where no one person, it's not the state, it's not the unions, it's an agreement. It's just an unwritten, I don't even think it's policy, to be honest. It's not even a written doc. It's just an agreement. It's almost culture that for the good of our economy, let's just do it. Let's just do it, right? And that's why I say you're right. It's not impossible to synthesize, but it will take time because you have to change the incentive structure of the society and the economy.
Yeah. Another question here and this is a comment from Mulelo Sochifa. Thank you so much for joining in. It's my aunt, shout out. Hey. So some companies also opt for quote unquote cheap or affordable labor/resources in the ICT space. These companies would rather go to India over local South African skills. And I think this goes back to what you were saying, with regards to the coordinated versus the liberal economy, right? In a world where you have market players that can choose which resources they get, they are likely to choose the cheapest resource. And sometimes the South African resource isn't that cheap. So Bongani, in closing, really, and I think Mulelo's question is going to really help us close, because this is where I want you to land the conversation. Because the big thing, in my opinion, and anyone who's watching can probably agree, that the big thing you've really been harping on is this issue of the social compact, almost this triangular relationship between labor, between education system and government, right? Industry, education system and government, right? Really, really land on the importance of that in order to achieve some kind of solutions to our very basic education problems, right? Because what I'm hearing is that we're missing each other. So we're overproducing this, and there's not enough of that, but we're missing that. Right? There's no conversation with this actor because there was never consultation about the direction where that other actor is going. So how do we achieve this, right? And I think Mulelo's question really helps us couch that question very nicely, because it does speak about the fact that in the end, companies do their own thing. But because that's also because education systems are doing their own thing. That's also because government is doing its own thing. So how do we synthesize it? Let's hack it. How do we hack it, bro?
And I think Bulelo's question is a very strong one, because it speaks to the liberal market economy. I go for the cheapest so I can make more profits and clobber my competition. Whereas in Germany, a lot of companies are willing to go for more expensive local labor because it's part of the social agreement. So in South Africa, again, I don't have a solid policy recommendation, but the one thing, and again, my brilliant supervisor keeps emphasizing this, we need to stop rushing to reform things and give them time to settle in. OBE education, rush to change that. CAPS, rush to change that. We rush to change things when they're not working over 5 years, but we forget that a lot of countries that got these things right got them right over decades and decades and decades until incentive structures developed organically. So the first thing I would say from a policy level is that if we develop what we think is a good policy, let's actually give it time and stop canceling it after 5 years and hoping that if we keep reforming, things will get better, right? So right now, for example, we're not giving businesses enough time to adapt to the current TVET system, to the current university system. We reform it, before they even have a chance to have a say, or they ask for reform before the government has even gotten enough time to get things right. So I think let's stop rushing to change policy and thinking that the solution lies in the content of the document as opposed to in an organic relationship developing over time. So that's how I'd close it off, is we need to stop rushing, because we rush to the sexy response, to the sexy solution, instead of trying to work it out organically through relationships and incentive structures.
What you're saying, Bongani, is very important, because this posture that we assume, posture where we basically design policy by popular discourse. We don't design policy by principle, or we don't design policy by objective outcome and incentive. right?
That exists.
And so that thing must stop, because in the end, if we keep rushing and if we keep hopping onto new conversations prematurely, what happens is that funds go onto the wrong things all the time, which perpetuates the problem with the education system right now. And people keep slipping through the cracks. So Wani, thank you very much for your contributions to to this episode of Tshimong Talks. I think it's very important, especially for those who are in the education space, again, which is everybody in the world, to be honest with you. And everybody is a person of interest in education globally. So these are very important conversations to have within our lexicon. And these are things that we don't often prioritize. So Bongani, I really appreciate your insights, and I appreciate you sharing your research and generally lending us your credibility. It's been really amazing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bongani. And guys, thank you very much for tuning in. Remember, the podcast episode is going to be coming out very soon, so always look out for that. We always have a podcast version coming out, from these live conversations that we have. Feel free to jump on UJ Library's Facebook page as well, and YouTube, which is actually where it's streaming live right now, to share this conversation. And to have these conversations continuously, right? I'd like to thank the entire team really that puts together Tshimong Talks all the time, from Engage Africa Media and the people at Tshimong, Tato Mutsusi, Thabo Masilela, Mukwena Moloto, Mohale Rasihala. And I want to thank, a special thank you to our partners, fruitful partnership here at University of Johannesburg Library, the home of the 4IR, people that are concerned with today's education system. And also, most importantly, I'd like to thank all those that have tuned in and that have become regular fans of Tshimong Talks, that come in on a monthly basis to tune in to these very important conversations that we would have in the debate room, but now we've popularized them all together. Thank you very much, guys. And we will see you very soon. How do you want me to do it? I'm happy